Shalom. Even though I'm giving this sermon in my home in the United States, consider this the first in my series of videos from our Israel trip, because this is the gist of the words that I'm going to offer as a Devar Torah in the conservative synagogue in Jerusalem that we're going to be attending next Shabbat. Now, this week, when I'm filming this, the Torah portion is Bahar, but next week it's Behaalotchka, which is the final Torah portion of Leviticus, of Vayikra. And I have a video on Bahar Behaalotchka, but this is a special word for a mixed audience of Israelis and Americans. And many of the people who attend that synagogue in Jerusalem actually were born outside of Israel, many in England and the United States. And I hope these words will be appropriate for both communities. Well, first of all, the Torah portion. We always start with the Torah portion. And Behaalotchka has one of two main tochachot, which are in the Torah. Now, a tochacha is an admonition. It's a very severe promise, negative promise by God of severe problems that will arise if the people don't obey. Now, in Vayikra, there's a particular characteristic of that tochacha, which is national. The admonitions and curses are in plural, and when you read it, it's clear that there'll be a national disaster that will take place if, in fact, things don't go right, if the people don't obey the covenant. Now, I don't necessarily believe in that theology, but it's interesting to note that, of course, there was a national disaster with the destruction of the first temple of Solomon that he built in 586 BCE. Now, there is an additional tochacha, which is in Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, and that is very different. That tochacha is mostly in the singular, and it's of an individual character. Now, Rav Amiel, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv at one point, said that when we read the first tochacha, it seems to deal with a national disaster, which results from the loss of statehood. His conjecture is supported by the fact that the warnings in the portion we read in Behaalotchka are in the plural. They refer to a collective collapse of the nation. They describe the destruction of the soil, the devastation that will come to the country and its national institutions. However, in Deuteronomy, he pointed out that it's individual morality. It's a disintegration of the individual. You shall have no faith in your own existence. And so, how do we understand those two different tochachot in the context of what we face today? Well, the end of Vayikra is the end of something that was set in routine, of the rules of the Kohen, and many of the laws and the beautiful laws of how people should get along in Leviticus 19. But the fourth book of the Torah is called Bamidbar, the wilderness, and it consists of stories with really no end, because at the end of that book, things are not clear. The Jewish people still are not in the promised land. Now, it depends when you take a vantage point reading from. If you would step back 100 years and look at the two major Jewish communities in the world today, Israel and the United States, in 1908 they looked very different. There was no guarantee that the United States was going to be the amazing Jewish community that it has become, with well over 6 million Jews. Now, of course there are challenges, but there are volumes and volumes of pages of the amount of Jewish institutions that exist, the amount of Jewish infrastructure, the contributions of Jews in America, the vitality and richness and thoroughness and vibrancy of the Jewish community. At the same point, if you would have stood in Israel in 1908, who would have believed that there'd be a Jewish state, and that it would have almost the majority or maybe the majority of world Jewry, that would be one of the most successful nations on earth? Who would have believed it? In fact, we celebrated the 95th birthday of a congregant last week who was an early chalutza. She and her husband went to Israel in the early 1930s and stayed for several years and helped build Israel in the early formative stages. This is, 15 years before Israel became a state. Now, we know all of those vantage points. We look ahead and we see the beauty of it, but also we know the dangers. And there are many unknowns today. And God forbid we should face a tochacha, the consequences of the tochacha, destruction of the individual or the nation. From the vantage point of the tochacha today and concern about the nation of Israel, despite its amazing success, and I believe it's the most successful country per capita in the world, Israel still faces very serious challenges to its existence, from Iran and the potential nuclear consequences that it faces. The moron bin Laden, the very dangerous terrorist leader, said all the problems in the world are caused by Israel. No, Israel solves most of the problems in the world. The problems in the world are caused by people like bin Laden. And yet Israel faces those challenges with daily rockets coming from Gaza by Hamas, Hezbollah increasingly gaining power in Lebanon, and the other challenges that Israel faces. And in the United States, of course, we have responsibilities to support Israel. I'm going to AIPAC convention, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, right after I get back from Israel. And there, all three major presidential candidates are going to give major addresses. Prime Minister Olmert will, the leadership of the House and Senate. More than half the Senate and House will be at the final dinner on Tuesday night. It's an amazing show of solidarity and support for the state of Israel. But of course, that's necessary, and thank God America does that. And in terms of the second tochecha in Deuteronomy, we have an additional challenge of the individual, because Jewish communities are made individual by individual. And even as I participated in the conversion of 5 different new Jews today, we still face the great challenges of assimilation in America. Just tell you a couple of stories. I enjoy reading, or sometimes don't enjoy, the wedding section of the New York Times every Sunday, because it gives you a light on a look at what's happening in American society. And last week there was a wedding. It said that there was a couple that got married. They had Episcopalian priests perform the ceremony, and it had including Jewish and Muslim elements, and then a Persian cleric conducted another ceremony later for them. So how do you get a couple that has a mishmash of Episcopalian, Jewish, Muslim, Persian? And then there was an interview in Parade magazine with Sarah Jessica Parker, who's starring in a big new movie coming out. It said that her father's Jewish and her husband, I think it's her husband, Broderick's mother is also Jewish. They consider themselves cultural Jews, and they're raising their son in the same tradition. What does that mean? Oh, it means, she said, a lot of empathy. It's bagels. It's whitefish salad. But they have a babysitter who's a devout Catholic from Brazil, and she says prayers, and she has influence on him too. All right, no problem. Do you think he'll end up going to synagogue? Oh, no, he'll probably end up a Unitarian, she says about her son. So that's the extent of Jewish commitment in that couple. Well, obviously we have many problems in America dealing with the assimilation and education and inculcating Jewish commitment among our own people. And that has to do more with the tochecha of Deuteronomy of the individual soul. And so we have both those challenges facing us today. For the American Jewish community, there's really 2 challenges. One is, how do we communicate the vitality and beauty and love of Jewish tradition in a way that will perpetuate it, bring more people to it, keep the people that we have, and raise their desire to live even more Jewishly. At the same time, how do we continue to use our resources and our energy to no longer view Israel as a poor stepchild, because it's a very successful country, but do what we can to influence the United States to continue to support Israel the way it has. President Bush is in Israel well, he's actually, as I'm speaking, may have just left Israel, but when I give this sermon in a week, he'll have just been to Israel and gave a very strong supportive statement about Israel in Israel. And for the Jewish people in Israel, who have made that their home, thank goodness, their responsibility is to help provide a spiritual center for world Jewry. It's an incubator for Jewish life, to defend the land of Israel, to continue to be a light to the nations. I mean, if you think about the amazing successes that Israel has just in the first 6 months of 2008 in every area of technology and medicine and agriculture, compared to what contributions has the Muslim world made in 2008 other than pump oil from their sand, it's amazing. And just today in the newspaper, when I'm delivering this, there was a story that Israel ranks #1 in the world by the pro-life index. And I don't mean anti-abortion. I mean, by putting together all of the things that go into whether a society loves life, Israel scored #1 in the world in that survey, according to the newspapers. It's a testimony to the amazing vitality of that culture, despite the fact that it has to spend more than 1/3 of its resources, more than any other nation in the world, on just simply surviving against the enemies that surround it. And so, as we deal with this tochecha today, this Torah portion that's read in a very quick and hushed voice because it's so terrifying, and the one in Deuteronomy that comes in a couple of months, one dealing with the national concerns and one with the individual concerns, we have to continue in both levels of our person and our peoplehood to encourage and support and welcome Jewish life. Shalom.